The call came at 12:24 a.m. I had barely closed my eyes when my phone lit up on the passenger seat beside me. My neck ached from trying to sleep in a car that had never been meant for sleeping, and my fingers were still numb from the cold. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Michael. I answered on the third ring. For a moment he didn't speak. All I heard was breathing, quick, uneven nothing like the calm, confident voice I'd lived beside for 22 years. Then he whispered, "Sarah, why are you all over the news?" I frowned and looked around. Across the parking lot, a 24-hour gas station had a television mounted over the coffee counter. The volume was low, but every customer inside was staring at the screen. A woman in a red winter coat was climbing through the shattered window of an SUV, sinking into icy water. Even before the camera caught her face, I knew it was me. 6 hours earlier, my husband had asked me not to come home for Christmas. That wasn't the moment our marriage broke. It was simply the moment I finally realized it already had. 3 days earlier, Christmas still looked ordinary. The tree was already standing in our living room. It wasn't a fancy tree, just the same artificial one we'd used for nearly 15 years. Every December, I insisted on fluffing every branch by hand while Michael laughed and said nobody would ever notice the difference. I always answered the same way. I'll know. For most of our marriage, those little conversations had been enough. I was 45 years old. Michael was 4 years older than I was. We'd been married for 22 years, long enough to finish each other's grocery lists, but not always each other's sentences anymore. People assume marriages collapse because of one terrible event. Most don't. Most fade quietly. One canceled dinner, one forgotten anniversary, one conversation where someone stops asking how your day was. By the time either person notices, loneliness has already unpacked its suitcase. I had left my accounting job 7 years earlier to care for my mother after her stroke. We both believed it would only be temporary. Then 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Somewhere along the way, returning to work became something we talked about instead of something we planned. When Mom passed away 18 months earlier, I suddenly had time again. Michael had something else. A promotion. Regional operations director. Longer hours. Business dinners. Weekend conferences. His world kept growing while mine had become strangely quiet. I tried not to resent that. In fact, I was proud of him. I only wished he still looked at me the way he had before the promotion. 3 days before Christmas, he called while I was wrapping gifts in the dining room. "Hey," I answered, smiling. His voice sounded distracted. "Are you home?" "Where else would I be? I need to tell you something." Those words are rarely followed by anything good. I put the scissors down. "What happened?" "My boss, Richard Coleman. Remember I told you he might be staying in town?" "I remember." "Well, he and Diane are coming for Christmas Eve." I smiled. "That's wonderful. I'll make the roast instead of the ham." Silence. Not long. Just long enough. "I was actually thinking," he began. "Whenever someone starts a sentence that way, they're usually hoping you'll finish it for them." I didn't. "I was thinking it might be better if you weren't here." I honestly thought I'd misheard him. "What?" "They're important clients now, Sarah. Richard wants a quiet evening." "I'm your wife." "I know." Another pause. "I just don't want anything to feel awkward." The word stayed with me. Awkward. After 22 years together, I had somehow become awkward. I stared at the half-wrapped box on the table. Inside was the watch he'd mentioned months ago while walking past a jewelry store. He'd forgotten the conversation. I hadn't. "I don't understand," I said softly. "It's only one night." One night. Funny how life-changing decisions are often packaged as temporary inconveniences. "I've already planned Christmas dinner." "I appreciate that." He sounded sincere. That almost made it worse. "There are plenty of nice hotels nearby." Hotels. He wasn't asking me to visit my sister. He wasn't suggesting I spend the evening with friends. He was asking me to leave my own home. "I'll pay for everything," he added quickly, as though money could make the sentence kinder. I walked into the living room. The stockings were already hanging over the fireplace. His. Mine. Neither looked different from any other year. Yet suddenly neither felt like it belonged to me. "Sarah." "I'm here." I don't want this to become a fight. Neither did I. Mostly because I wasn't sure there was anything left to fight for. "When should I leave?" I asked. He let out a breath I hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Maybe tomorrow afternoon." "Tomorrow. Not next week. Tomorrow." I closed my eyes. "Okay. You understand?" "No, but understanding and accepting aren't the same thing. I'll figure something out." He thanked me. Actually thanked me. Then he hung up. I stood in the middle of the living room listening to the silence. The furnace kicked on. Outside, snow drifted across the front yard. Inside, the Christmas lights blinked exactly as they had 10 minutes earlier. Nothing had changed. Except somehow everything had. The next morning, I packed one small suitcase. Not because I owned little. Because I couldn't decide what still felt like mine. Before zipping it closed, I reached into the closet and pulled out the red wool scarf Michael had given me on our 10th anniversary. For a second, I almost left it behind. Then I wrapped it around my neck. Whatever happened next, I refused to leave every good memory in that house. I picked up my suitcase, looked around one last time, and quietly locked the front door behind me. I had no idea that by the end of Christmas Eve, the entire country would know my face. The motel sat behind a gas station off Interstate 75, the kind of place people use when they are passing through, not when their own house is 20 minutes away. The sign outside flickered between vacancy and vaca CY. A plastic Santa stood near the office door, leaning slightly to one side like even he was tired of pretending. I parked beside a blue pickup dusted with road salt and sat there for a moment with both hands still on the steering wheel. I had never spent Christmas Eve in a motel before. That sounds like a small thing until it happens. Inside the room smelled faintly of bleach old carpet and the lemon cleaner people use when they're trying to cover up something sad. There was one bed, one chair, one lamp with a crooked shade, and a television mounted to the wall. The heater under the window rattled every time it kicked on. I set my suitcase on the luggage rack and stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with myself. At home, there would have been potatoes to peel, candles to arrange, napkins to fold. I would have checked the roast twice too often and asked Michael whether he wanted the good wine opened before dinner or after. Here there was nothing to prepare. Nothing expected of me. Nobody waiting. I took off my coat, then put it back on because the room hadn't warmed up yet. I laughed once quietly, not because anything was funny. Sometimes your body reaches for laughter when crying would take too much energy. Around noon, Michael texted, "Hope you're settled. Thank you for understanding." I stared at the message longer than necessary. There were so many things I could have typed. I could have asked whether Richard Coleman knew his employee had sent his wife away from her own home. I could have asked whether Diane would notice the missing stocking over the fireplace. I could have asked if Michael planned to explain where I was, or if he would simply fold me out of the evening like a chair nobody needed. Instead, I wrote, "I'm fine." 2 words. The most useful lie in marriage. After that, I drove to a shopping plaza because the motel room felt too quiet. Most stores were closing early. Families hurried through parking lots with bags in their hands, children trailing behind them in puffy coats. A man carried a bouquet of grocery store flowers, probably bought at the last second, and I found myself hoping whoever received them would smile anyway. I bought a turkey sandwich from a deli that was about to close and a small carton of tomato soup from the grocery store. At the checkout, the cashier, a college-aged girl with silver nail polish, asked if I had big plans for Christmas. I almost said yes. Then I said quiet ones. She nodded like that sounded nice. Maybe for some people it was. Back at the motel, I ate sitting on the edge of the bed. The sandwich bread was dry, the soup was too salty. I finished both because wasting food still felt wrong, even on a night when everything else seemed out of place. By late afternoon, snow had started falling steadily. The flakes swirled under the parking lot lights, soft and pretty from behind glass. I turned on the television but didn't watch it. Holiday movies played on 3 channels. In every one of them, people found their way home before the final commercial break. I turned the television off. For a while, I tried reading. Then I tried calling my sister in Arizona, but the call went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I didn't want to hear myself explain. At 6:30, I opened the closet and looked at the shopping bag I'd carried out of the house that morning. Inside were Michael's gifts. The watch. A leather-bound planner because he still liked writing appointments by hand. A framed photo from our trip to Maine 12 years earlier, taken before promotions and quiet resentments and separate emotional climates. I had planned to give them to him after dinner. Now they sat beside a motel ironing board. At 7 o'clock, I did something I told myself I wouldn't do. I drove home. Not to go inside, not to embarrass him, not to ruin his important evening. Just to leave the gifts. The roads were slick but manageable. Christmas lights glowed along the neighborhoods like every house was trying to prove something. When I turned onto our street, I slowed before I reached the driveway. There were 3 cars outside. Michael's black sedan, a silver Lexus I didn't recognize, and Richard Coleman's dark Range Rover. Through the front window, I could see movement. Michael stood near the fireplace wearing the charcoal sweater I had bought him 2 years earlier. He was laughing, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of wine. Across from him stood a tall man with silver hair, likely Richard. Diane Coleman sat on our couch, my couch, with a red throw blanket over her lap. The house looked warm, full, complete. Without me. I parked 2 houses down and sat there until my breath fogged the windshield. Then I picked up the gift bag and walked carefully up the sidewalk. The porch light was on. The wreath I had made hung on the door. I could hear muffled voices from inside the low rhythm of comfortable conversation. For one foolish second I imagined knocking. Michael would open the door, startled, maybe embarrassed, maybe relieved. Maybe he would step outside, take my hand, and say he'd made a mistake. But hope can be cruel when it has no evidence. I set the bag beside the door. No note, no accusation, just gifts. As I turned to leave, laughter spilled from inside the house. A woman's laughter. Diane, probably. It wasn't wrong for her to laugh. It still hurt. I made it back to my car without looking through the window again. The drive away felt longer than the drive there. I didn't go back to the motel immediately. I couldn't. The thought of that stale room and crooked lamp made my chest tighten. So I kept driving through town past closed stores, dark office buildings, and neighborhoods where families gathered behind glowing windows. At 8:14, my phone buzzed with an alert from a local volunteer network I had joined years earlier when my mother was still alive. A winter shelter on the east side needed extra hands. A pipe had frozen, space was tight, and families were being redirected from a nearby church. I almost ignored it. Then I looked at the passenger seat where my purse sat beside nothing. No dinner to attend. No home to return to. No one expecting me. I tapped the screen and replied, "I can come?" The shelter operated out of an old community center with cinderblock walls and a basketball court that smelled faintly of floor wax. By the time I arrived, volunteers were unfolding cots, stacking blankets, and trying to keep track of names on clipboards. A young mother held a sleeping toddler against her shoulder. An elderly man argued gently with a staff member about whether he needed a second blanket. I took off my coat and asked where they needed me. For the next 2 hours I made coffee, passed out socks, helped carry boxes from a storage room, and found crayons for 2 little boys who were bored and scared. None of it was heroic. It was just useful. And useful felt better than unwanted. Around 10:40 things finally settled. The shelter director, a woman named Marcy with tired eyes and a voice that could cut through chaos, touched my arm. "You should head out before the roads get worse." I nodded, though part of me didn't want to leave. Outside, the cold hit hard. Snow blew sideways across the parking lot. I wrapped Michael's old scarf tighter around my neck and walked to my car. I had just pulled onto the highway when I saw brake lights ahead. Then headlights tilted at a strange angle near the river road. At first I thought someone had spun into a ditch. Then I saw the SUV. Its front end had broken through the guardrail. Its back wheels were still on the bank, but the hood was already sinking into the black, icy water below. For 1 second I couldn't move. Then a child's hand appeared against the rear window. I pulled over, grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment, and ran. The wind nearly knocked me sideways as I reached the guardrail. The SUV had punched through the metal barrier and come to rest at a steep angle, its front end already disappearing into the dark river. Snow blew across the roadway so heavily that the flashing hazard lights looked blurred, almost underwater themselves. I could hear screaming. Not loud, not constant. The kind of frightened voices people make when panic is stealing their breath. My phone was already in my hand before I reached the driver's door. 911, what's your emergency? An SUV is going into the river off County Road 18 just north of Mill Creek Bridge, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. There are people trapped inside. Please hurry. The dispatcher began asking questions, but I had already reached the vehicle. I have to go. I dropped the phone into my coat pocket without waiting for permission. The driver's side door wouldn't budge. The impact had twisted the frame. Inside, a man in his late 50s was pounding against the window. Blood ran from a cut across his forehead. A woman in the passenger seat kept trying to unbuckle herself, but the angle of the vehicle made every movement awkward. Then I heard a little girl's voice. "My brother..." I turned toward the back seat. 2 children. A boy who looked around 7. A girl maybe 10 years old. The water had already reached the floorboards. Another car stopped behind mine. A young man jumped out, his face pale. "What do we do?" "Call 911 if you haven't already," I shouted. "Then help me." He nodded immediately. Together we pulled at the rear passenger door. Nothing. Frozen shut. The girl inside pressed both hands against the glass. Her lips were moving. I couldn't hear her. I didn't need to. She was saying the same thing every terrified child says. Help me. The young man grabbed a tire iron from his truck. Stand back. The first swing bounced off the glass. The second left only a crack. The third shattered the rear window into a spray of tiny cubes. Cold river water rushed inside. The children screamed. Cover your faces, I yelled. I reached through the broken window, brushing away loose glass before grabbing the little boy first. He was shaking so hard I could barely get a grip on him. The young man carried him toward the road while I reached back inside. The girl didn't move. My mom, no, she pointed toward the front seats. I'm not leaving her. For one impossible second, I saw myself 20 years earlier. Not because she looked like me. Because love can make ordinary people stubborn enough to risk everything. I climbed halfway through the broken window. The freezing water hit my knees immediately. Every instinct told me to get out. Instead, I reached for the girl's seatbelt. It refused to release. My fingers were numb. I tried again. Nothing. The SUV shifted another inch toward the river. Outside, someone shouted, "It's moving!" I ignored them. The buckle finally clicked. There you go. The girl grabbed my arm. No, she cried. My mom. I looked toward the front. The driver had finally forced his own door open a few inches. A firefighter wasn't there yet. Neither was anyone else trained for this, just frightened strangers. The woman in the passenger seat had managed to free herself but couldn't climb over the center console because of the angle. The young man appeared beside the window again. I've got the kids. Take her. He lifted the little girl through the opening. As soon as she was clear, I crawled farther inside. The water was almost to my waist now. The woman reached toward me. I can't. You can. I wedged one shoulder against the back of her seat and pushed while pulling her coat with my other hand. The movement was enough. She slid free. Together, we scrambled toward the broken rear window. Just as we fell onto the snowy riverbank, the SUV lurched forward another 2 feet. Everyone stumbled backward instinctively. Within seconds, the front half disappeared beneath the dark water. Silence, except for the wind. Then distant sirens. The first deputy sheriff arrived less than 4 minutes later. Fire engines followed. Paramedics, state troopers. The scene exploded into organized chaos. Someone wrapped a blanket around the little boy. Another EMT examined the driver's head wound. The little girl refused to let go of her mother's hand. I stood off to one side, soaked to the skin, shivering so violently my teeth hurt. An EMT approached me. Ma'am, you're bleeding. I looked down. A long cut stretched across the back of my left hand. I hadn't even noticed. I'm okay. Let's make sure. He guided me toward the ambulance. As he cleaned the cut, another paramedic checked my blood pressure. You went into that vehicle. I nodded. You could have died. So could they. He smiled faintly. Fair point. Across the road, I noticed a television camera. A local news crew. Someone must have heard the emergency call over the scanner. The reporter stood near the patrol cars, speaking into a microphone while snow swirled around her. A cameraman wandered through the safe perimeter collecting footage. I paid almost no attention. Reporters come and go. Lives matter more. A firefighter carrying a thermal blanket walked over. The family wants to thank you. I shook my head. They don't have to. They insisted. The father approached slowly, his forehead bandaged. He looked at me for several seconds before speaking. I don't know your name. Sarah, he swallowed. Sarah, you saved my family. I wasn't sure how to answer. So I simply said, I'm glad you're all here. His daughter suddenly ran across the snow and hugged me around the waist. Her winter coat was still damp. So are we. That nearly broke me. Not because of the words, because children rarely thank people the way adults do. Adults worry about saying the right thing. Children simply tell the truth. The reporter noticed us and walked over cautiously. I'm Rachel Morgan with Channel 8. Would you mind answering one question? I almost said no. Instead, I nodded once. She held out the microphone. What made you run toward the vehicle when everyone else was still stopping? I looked back toward the river. The SUV had almost completely disappeared beneath the dark water. I didn't really think I admitted. There were children inside. Rachel waited, expecting more. There wasn't any. So you don't consider yourself a hero? I smiled, tired more than anything else. I think most people would have done exactly the same thing. She thanked me. The interview lasted less than 30 seconds. I climbed into my car shortly afterward. The heater took forever to warm up. My clothes were soaked. My hands still shook against the steering wheel. By the time I pulled back onto the highway, it was a little after midnight. I had no idea the brief interview was already being replayed on every local television station. And I certainly had no idea that somewhere across town my husband had just looked up from Christmas dessert and seen my face on the screen. The drive back to the motel should have taken 15 minutes. Instead, it took almost 30. The snow kept coming thick enough that the highway disappeared beneath a blanket of white. My windshield wipers worked, constantly pushing away flakes, only to have another wave replace them seconds later. The cut on my hand had stopped bleeding, but it stung every time I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. Mostly I felt tired. Not dramatic movie scene tired. Just the quiet exhaustion that comes after your body spends 20 minutes running on adrenaline and suddenly remembers it's 45 years old. The motel parking lot was almost empty when I pulled in. I shut off the engine and sat there for a minute. Everything had become strangely quiet again. The rescue already felt unreal, as though it had happened to someone else. I grabbed my purse, climbed out of the car, and limped toward my room. Halfway across the parking lot, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I ignored it. Then another. Then another. By the time I unlocked the motel room door, there were 6 missed calls and 3 text messages from numbers I didn't recognize. I frowned. Wrong number, maybe. I tossed the phone onto the bed and headed for the bathroom. My clothes were still damp despite the heater in the car. The hot shower felt almost painful at first. As warmth returned to my hands, I finally allowed myself to think about what had happened. The little girl's face, the freezing water, the sound of breaking glass, the father thanking me. Then another thought pushed its way in. Michael. For a second I wondered how Christmas dinner had gone. Had Richard enjoyed the roast? Had Diane complimented the decorations? Had anyone asked where Michael's wife was? I pushed the thought away. It didn't matter anymore. After drying off, I changed into sweatpants and one of Michael's old college t-shirts I'd packed without thinking. Old habits. Some disappear slowly. I had just lowered myself onto the edge of the bed when my phone exploded with notifications. Buzz. 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 The screen lit up continuously. Voicemail. Text messages. Missed calls. Then one name appeared. Michael. I stared at it. He hadn't called once since asking me to leave. Now he was calling after midnight. I answered. Hello. Silence, then his breathing. Fast. Uneven. Sarah. I'm here. Another pause. When he finally spoke, his voice barely sounded like his own. Honey. He swallowed hard. Why are you all over the news? I frowned. What? They're showing you. What are you talking about? Every station. His words tumbled over each other. They keep replaying it. I looked toward the television mounted above the dresser. It was still off. I reached for the remote and pressed the power button. A local station appeared immediately. Breaking news? Christmas Eve rescue. Video filled the screen. There I was, running through the snow toward the SUV. Another angle showed me climbing through the broken rear window. Another showed the little girl wrapping her arms around me. The footage looped again and again. I stared without saying a word. I've been trying to reach you for 20 minutes. Michael said. I didn't know. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard another voice in the background. Richard. It was muffled but unmistakable. Did you reach her? Michael covered the phone. I did. Even from a distance, I could hear the disbelief in Richard Coleman's voice. Is she all right? Michael answered quietly. Yes. Then Richard asked the question that changed everything. The woman who saved those people. Another pause. That's your wife. Michael didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Silence answered for him. On television, the reporter stood beside the river, identified only as Sarah. Then came the short interview. What made you go back into the vehicle? There were children inside. What do you think people should know about tonight? I hope that family gets to spend Christmas together. That was all. Nothing dramatic. Nothing heroic. Yet somehow hearing my own voice made tears sting my eyes. Because while I had been wishing another family could stay together, mine had already fallen apart. Michael returned to the phone. Sarah. Yes. I'm coming to get you. The sentence arrived too late. I looked around the motel room. One suitcase. One paper cup beside the sink. One plastic Christmas wreath hanging crookedly outside the window. No. I shouldn't have asked you to leave. No. I made a mistake. You made a choice. The difference hung between us, heavy, real. I wasn't thinking. I know. I need to explain. I closed my eyes. For tonight? My voice stayed calm. You don't. He exhaled shakily. I've never been more ashamed of myself. I believed him. That didn't erase anything. Another notification appeared across my screen while we were still talking. Rachel Morgan, Channel 8, requesting interview. Another followed. Then another. A statewide news station. Then a radio producer. Then someone from a national morning show. I muted the phone for a second, staring at the flood of requests. The rescue had become a story. People loved Christmas miracles. They loved ordinary people doing extraordinary things. They had no idea the woman on their television had nowhere to spend Christmas Eve. Michael heard the notifications. Who's calling? Reporters. Oh. His voice sounded smaller than I'd ever heard it. They're probably going to ask where you were tonight. I didn't answer, because I genuinely hadn't thought about that. The truth wasn't complicated. It wasn't scandalous. It was simply sad. A producer left a voicemail almost immediately. Mrs. Bennett, we'd love to hear your story. My story. I almost laughed. The rescue wasn't really the story. The real story had started 3 days earlier with one quiet phone call. Michael spoke again. Please don't tell them. What? About us? I looked back at the television. The footage replayed once more. The little girl. The shattered glass. The river. Then I thought about our living room. The empty place where my stocking should have been. I haven't decided to tell anyone anything. I appreciate that. I didn't say I was protecting you. Silence. Longer this time. Finally I spoke. Go back to your guests, Michael. They already left. That surprised me. When, about 20 minutes after the news started? I didn't ask why. I already knew. Because some moments expose a person more completely than words ever can. Michael had spent the evening trying to impress the man who signed his paychecks. Instead, that same man had watched television and discovered exactly how his employee had treated his own wife. The irony wasn't satisfying, just heartbreaking. I hope you get some sleep, Michael said quietly. So do I. The call ended. I placed the phone on the nightstand and turned back toward the television. Outside, snow continued falling over the empty parking lot. Inside, every station seemed to be telling the same story. A woman had risked everything so strangers wouldn't spend Christmas mourning the people they loved. No one watching knew she had spent the holiday wondering whether she still belonged in her own home. I woke up the next morning to sunlight reflecting off fresh snow. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then I saw the motel curtains, the small round table, and the paper coffee cup sitting beside the television. Christmas morning. Not exactly how I'd imagined spending it. My phone had finally stopped vibrating sometime before dawn. When I picked it up, there were more than 100 notifications waiting. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Former coworkers. Neighbors. People from my old church. Every message said some version of the same thing. We saw you on TV. Are you okay? We're so proud of you. One message stood apart from the others. It was from Rachel Morgan, the reporter. Sarah, I understand you've had a long night. If you're willing, I'd appreciate the chance to hear your story. Not just the rescue, but the person behind it. I read the message twice, then I set the phone down. For years, I'd quietly cared for my mother. I had volunteered when I could. I'd lived an ordinary life. The rescue didn't make me extraordinary. It simply placed an ordinary decision under extraordinary circumstances. After checking out of the motel, I stopped at a small diner outside Dayton. The waitress recognized me almost immediately. Weren't you the woman from the news? I smiled awkwardly. I guess so. She refused to charge me for breakfast. I argued. She insisted. It's Christmas, she said. Let somebody do something nice for you. I thanked her and left an extra tip beneath the coffee cup anyway. Around noon, Rachel called again. This time I answered. I promise, she said, I'm not looking for drama. I've had enough of that. She laughed softly. I figured. We met at a quiet park overlooking the frozen river. No cameras. No television crew. Just Rachel with a notebook and 2 cups of coffee. For nearly an hour, she asked about my volunteer work, my mother, my career before becoming a caregiver, and what had gone through my mind when I saw the SUV. She never asked me to exaggerate. She never interrupted. Then she asked one final question. What were you supposed to be doing last night? I looked across the frozen pond where a father was teaching his son how to throw breadcrumbs to the ducks. I was supposed to be home. Rachel waited. My husband was hosting his boss for Christmas. And you? I spent the night elsewhere. She didn't immediately write anything down. Instead, she asked quietly, was that your choice? I looked at the paper coffee cup warming my hands. No. That single word carried 22 years inside it. Rachel closed her notebook. You don't have to say anything else. I know. But sometimes one honest sentence explains more than 1,000 angry ones. She was right. Later that afternoon, her article appeared online. It wasn't about a hero. It was about kindness. About ordinary people choosing courage when no one expected it. Near the end, she included one short paragraph. Sarah Bennett said she had planned to spend Christmas at home, but unexpected circumstances changed those plans. She hopes the rescued family will always remember that they were together when it mattered most. She never mentioned Michael by name. She never mentioned our marriage. She didn't have to. People began asking their own questions. By evening, the article had spread far beyond Ohio. Comments poured in from people who had spent holidays alone. Widows, veterans, divorced parents, adult children caring for aging spouses. Many weren't talking about the rescue at all. They were talking about loneliness. One comment stayed with me. Sometimes the deepest wound isn't being hated. It's realizing someone found it easier to celebrate without you. I read it 3 times, because it was true. That same afternoon, Michael walked into his office building to retrieve a presentation he needed for the following week. Richard Coleman happened to be there. The building was nearly empty. Richard stood near the elevator holding a cardboard box of files. Morning, Michael. Morning. Richard studied him for a long moment. I read the article. Michael nodded. So did I. Another silence. Then Richard spoke in the calm voice of someone who had spent decades leading people. My wife couldn't stop talking about Sarah. Michael looked down. She thinks your wife is remarkable. I know. Richard shifted the box to his other arm. Do you know what impressed Diane the most? Michael shook his head. It wasn't the rescue. He waited. It was the fact that Sarah never once blamed anyone. Those words landed harder than criticism. Richard continued. I've managed people for almost 30 years. I know. And I've learned something. He paused. The way someone treats the people who love them eventually becomes the way they treat everyone else. Michael didn't answer. Richard sighed. I hope you fix this. So do I. I mean before it's too late. When Richard walked away, Michael remained standing in the hallway long after the elevator doors had closed. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about promotions, or quarterly reports, or impressing executives. He was thinking about a woman who had quietly packed one suitcase because he had asked her to leave. Meanwhile, I drove to my sister Claire's house. She lived nearly an hour away. When she opened the door, she didn't say, I saw the news. She simply hugged me. The kind of hug that asks no questions. Later that evening, while we washed dishes together, she looked over at me. What happens now? I dried another plate before answering. I honestly don't know. Do you still love him? I smiled sadly. Love isn't the difficult question. What is? Whether I can trust the person he became. Claire nodded. She understood. Some marriages don't end because love disappears. They end because respect quietly leaves first. That night, my phone buzzed once more. This time it wasn't Michael calling. It was a single text. I don't expect forgiveness today. I only hope you'll someday believe that I'm truly sorry. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned the phone over without replying. Some apologies deserve to be heard. But every apology has to wait until the person receiving it is finally ready. 3 weeks passed before I heard Michael's voice again. Not through a voicemail. Not through a text message. In person. I had started volunteering every Wednesday afternoon at the same community center where I'd spent Christmas Eve. The rescue had brought donations from all over the state. Blankets lined one wall. Shelves overflowed with canned food. Families I had never met stopped by simply to say thank you. Life had become strangely full. Not because I had become famous. Because I had remembered something I had forgotten while caring for everyone else. I still had a life of my own. That Wednesday I was sorting children's coats by size when someone quietly said my name. Sarah. I turned around. Michael stood just inside the doorway. He looked different. Not older. Just smaller somehow. The confidence that had always filled every room before him had disappeared. He wasn't carrying flowers. He wasn't holding a speech. He simply stood there with both hands in the pockets of his winter coat. I asked Marcy if it was all right to stop by. I glanced toward the director's office. Marcy smiled once before disappearing around the corner, wisely giving us privacy. What are you doing here? I asked. I wanted to tell you something without a phone between us. I nodded. He took a slow breath. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to understand how I became someone capable of asking his wife to leave her own home. I didn't interrupt. I kept telling myself it was only one night. He looked down at the floor. But it wasn't one night. No, I said quietly. It wasn't. It was every business dinner I chose over you. Every weekend I answered emails instead of asking how your day had been. Every time I assumed you'd still be there tomorrow. His eyes met mine. I didn't lose you on Christmas Eve. I started losing you long before that. The honesty in those words settled between us. Not as an excuse, as recognition. I can't change what I did, he continued. I know. I've already spoken with Richard. I waited. I turned down the promotion they offered after New Year's. That surprised me. Why? Because I finally understood something. He smiled sadly. I kept chasing a career that would never sit beside me when I was 80. Silence followed. The kind that isn't uncomfortable, just thoughtful. I also sold the lake property I'd been saving for. You loved that place? I thought I did. He shrugged gently. It turns out I mostly loved the idea of proving I'd made it. I studied his face. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to impress anyone. Not even me. Especially not me. I've been seeing a counselor. Another surprise. Alone. So far. He nodded once. I needed someone to explain why success started feeling more important than kindness. I couldn't help smiling a little. And he said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. Michael looked toward the families walking through the community center. He said ambition becomes dangerous the moment it asks you to sacrifice the people who gave you the strength to pursue it. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I asked the question I'd been carrying since Christmas. Why didn't you simply tell Richard no? Michael closed his eyes briefly. Because I was afraid. Of what? That he'd think I wasn't committed enough. He laughed once. A week later, he told me he would have respected me more if I'd insisted my wife stayed. Life has a strange sense of irony. The thing we fear losing often slips away because of the choices we make trying to protect it. Michael reached into his coat pocket. I brought something. It wasn't jewelry. It wasn't an expensive gift. It was my Christmas stocking. The one that had hung beside his every December. I couldn't look at the fireplace anymore. He held it out carefully. I don't expect you to come home today. I accepted it. The knitted fabric still smelled faintly of cedar from the storage box in our attic. I don't even know if there will be a home for us again. I understand. I mean, really understand. I know. He smiled. You've always been honest. I've learned honesty is kinder than false hope. He nodded. I'll wait as long as it takes. You shouldn't wait forever. I'm not waiting because I have to. He looked directly at me. I'm waiting because I finally remember who I'm waiting for. The following months were quieter than either of us expected. We didn't move back together. Not immediately. Instead, we started over in smaller ways. Coffee on Saturday mornings, walks through the park, long conversations without phones on the table. Sometimes we talked about our marriage. Sometimes we talked about birds at the feeder outside my sister's kitchen window. Healing, I discovered, rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as ordinary moments. One afternoon in early spring, Michael helped repaint the community center. No reporters came. No cameras. No applause. When everyone else stopped for lunch, I found him quietly repairing a broken bookshelf in the children's reading room. You missed your break, I said. He smiled without looking up. I know. You don't have to prove anything. He finally looked at me. I'm not. He tightened one last screw and stood. I'm just trying to become someone I'd be proud to meet. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it erased the past. Nothing could. But because real change rarely begins with promises. It begins with different habits repeated over time. By the following Christmas, we weren't the same couple we'd once been. We were older, more careful with each other's hearts. The Christmas tree stood once again in our living room. The same artificial tree. The same handmade ornaments. The same stockings. Only this year, before hanging mine, Michael paused. I'm glad you're home, he said. I looked around the room. Home. I finally understood that home isn't the place where your name is on the deed. It's the place where your presence is never treated like an inconvenience. Sometimes life gives us a second chance, not because we deserve one, because we're finally willing to become the people we should have been all along. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed the way you looked at someone you loved, or the way you looked at yourself? Share your story in the comments below. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about family, forgiveness, and second chances, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Wherever you're watching from, thank you for spending your time with me today.